He controlled everything, my sister said. She wasn't speaking to me directly. She was speaking to the mediator, to the attorney beside her, to the court reporter in the corner, whose fingers paused for just a moment before resuming. My sister has a particular way of making accusations sound like observations. She uses a low, measured tone, the kind that implies the speaker is barely containing something much larger. I had heard her use it since we were children. For the last 3 years of my mother's life, she continued, he made every financial decision without consulting anyone. He moved her accounts. He influenced her will. She was 78 years old with advancing memory issues, and he was alone with her constantly. The mediator, a woman named Kathleen Vane, set down her pen. My sister's attorney, a man in his mid-50s named Cliff Hennessy, placed both hands flat on the table and added what they had clearly rehearsed. Our position is that the decedent lacked the capacity to execute the 2023 amended will, and that the pattern of isolation and undue influence exerted by her son is the most plausible explanation for its contents. I sat across from them with my hands folded and said nothing. I was 64 years old. I had spent 31 years as a senior investigator for the Indiana Department of Adult Services, Financial Crimes Division. My work for most of those years had involved sitting across tables from people who had taken things from elderly individuals, sometimes from strangers, sometimes from hired caregivers, and more often than anyone liked to acknowledge, from family members who had found ways to justify it to themselves. I was the person who built those cases. I was the person who prepared the documentation for prosecutors. I had never expected to be on the other side of that table. My sister and I grew up in Muncie, the children of a man who repaired appliances and a woman who taught elementary school for 26 years. Our father died when I was 34. After that, my mother lived alone in the house where we grew up for another 19 years, capable and independent in the way that certain women of her generation simply are. She drove until she was 76. She managed her own finances. She sent birthday cards on time to 11 grandchildren and never once forgot a single one. In her late 70s, things began to shift. Nothing dramatic at first. She repeated herself more often. She lost track of days. She started calling me by my father's name occasionally, which she always caught herself on and laughed about in a way that made it easier for both of us. My sister lived 40 minutes away and visited on holidays and occasional Sundays. I lived 12 minutes from Mother's house and came by 3 or 4 times a week. This was not a strategy. It was proximity and habit and the fact that I had retired and had the time. My sister worked long hours and had a husband and 2 teenagers at home, and I understood that. I never said anything about the difference in our involvement. I didn't think it required acknowledgement. When my mother's physician recommended a formal assessment, I went with her. My sister called in. The assessment showed mild cognitive impairment, not dementia, not incapacity, but a decline worth monitoring. My mother understood the results completely. On the drive home, she said, "I'm slower, but I'm not gone yet." She was correct about that for longer than I had expected. She updated her will in the spring of 2023. She did it with her own attorney, a woman she had used for 30 years, in an office I had never visited. I drove her there and waited in the parking lot. I did not know what she had changed until after she died. My mother passed in February of last year. She died at home on a Sunday with both of us present. The contested will filing arrived 11 weeks later. My sister's claim was that I had systematically isolated my mother from family contact in her final years, had exercised undue control over her financial accounts, and had exploited her diminished capacity to secure a disproportionate share of her estate. The amended will left the house and the majority of the savings to me, with a smaller portion to my sister. The previous version had split things more evenly. I sat in my car in the driveway and read the filing twice, then a third time. There is a particular quality to a document written by someone who believes they are describing you accurately. And there is a different quality to a document written by someone who has decided which facts to include and which to leave out. I had spent 3 decades learning to tell the difference. This was the second kind. My daughter called that evening. She was in Columbus, where she'd lived for 6 years with her husband and their 2 young children. She had visited my mother often and had been close to her grandmother in the particular way adult children sometimes manage before distance makes it complicated. "Your aunt sent me a copy of the filing," she said. I waited. "Did you know she was going to do this?" "No," I said. "She says you changed the will without telling anyone." "Your grandmother changed her will," I said, "with her own attorney." I drove her to the appointment and waited outside. There was a pause. "She says Grandma wasn't herself by then." "Your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing," I said. Another pause. I don't know what to believe, my daughter said. I told her I understood. I told her I wasn't asking her to take sides. I told her to take whatever time she needed. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long while. I wasn't angry at my daughter. She had been handed a version of events by someone she trusted, someone who used a low, measured tone that made accusations sound like concerns. I knew how that worked. I had interviewed dozens of families where this exact dynamic had played out. One person shaping the narrative, others receiving it, everyone believing they were responding to facts rather than to framing. The next morning, I drove to my mother's house. It still smelled like her. That combination of hand lotion and the faint trace of lavender soap she had used my entire life. The house had been cleaned since the funeral, but some things don't leave with the cleaning. I stood in the hallway for a moment before I went further. I went to her bedroom first. My mother was not a complicated woman in the way she organized her life. She kept important things in important places, and she told me where those places were, in the same matter-of-fact way she told me everything. When I was 12, she showed me where she kept the household documents. When I was in my 30s, she told me where the house deed was filed. In the last year of her life, she had told me 3 things in the same quiet, practical tone. She told me the combination to the lockbox in her closet. She told me that she had put something in it that she wanted me to have. And she told me that she had made a decision she was proud of and that she hoped I would understand it when the time came. The lockbox was on the shelf above her winter coats, a small gray metal box she had owned since I was a child. Inside were her marriage certificate, her birth certificate, a folded copy of my father's obituary, and a small digital voice recorder, the kind you can buy at any office supply store. Simple, sturdy, about the size of a deck of cards. I sat down on the closet floor with it. The recorder held 9 entries. They were dated across a period of 14 months, the last one recorded 3 weeks before she died. My mother's voice was slower than I remembered from 10 years ago, more deliberate but entirely clear. She spoke the way she always spoke, without performance, without self-pity, with the calm precision of a woman who had organized 26 years of lesson plans and found no reason to change that habit in old age. In the first entry, she explained why she was making the recordings. She had spoken with her attorney, she said, and had been advised that a voice record of her own thinking could be useful if anyone ever questioned her decisions. She wanted her intentions on record while she was still capable of clarity. In the entries that followed, she talked about the will. She talked about why she had made the changes she made. She talked about what she had observed over the years, which of her children had been present, which had not. She talked about specific conversations my sister had initiated over the years regarding the house and the savings account. She did not use the word manipulation. She chose her words carefully. She said, "My daughter means well, I believe, but she has been thinking about this house as hers for longer than she realizes." She said, "My son has been here. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing." In the final entry, recorded in January, she said something I was not prepared for. She said she knew her children might disagree after she was gone and that she had tried to make her intentions as clear as she could. She said she was not afraid of what came next. Then she said, "I raised a son who pays attention to the things that matter. I'm not worried about him. He knows how to take care of things quietly." I sat in that closet for a long time. I took the recorder with me when I left. I photographed everything in the lockbox without disturbing the originals. The lockbox stayed exactly as it was. That afternoon, I called an attorney named Dora Ellison, whom I had worked alongside on a joint state-federal case years earlier involving misappropriation of an elderly woman's pension accounts. Dora was in private practice now, in Indianapolis. She was methodical and unhurried and never offered reassurance she couldn't support with documentation. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "They made an assumption." "What kind?" I asked. "That you were just a grieving son with no frame of reference for how this works." She explained what contested will proceedings look like when the contested party knows what they're doing. The voice recordings, properly authenticated, were significant. My mother's longtime attorney could speak to her client's capacity and intent. The amendment had been witnessed, and my professional background, 31 years building cases precisely like the one being constructed against me, carried its own particular weight in a room where someone expected not to need to worry about it. "What do you want?" Dora asked. I thought about my mother's voice on that recorder, the way she had said, "I'm not worried about him." "I want her intentions respected," I said, "without me having to announce who I am." "Then we document everything and let the mediation do the rest," Dora said. "Can you let them believe they're winning for a few more weeks?" I told her I had some experience with that. For the 3 weeks before the hearing, I lived inside the frame my sister had constructed. I answered her calls in short sentences. I let her believe I was overwhelmed, still processing. I said nothing about Dora, nothing about the recorder, nothing about the 14 months of voice entries my mother had left in her careful, organized way. My sister's comfort was visible in those weeks. Her messages grew more confident, more certain. She sent an email suggesting we work together to reach a fair resolution, which, reading it plainly, meant she expected me to concede. People who believe they have already won tend to stop watching closely. Dora worked methodically. She had the recordings authenticated by a third-party audio forensics firm. She obtained a formal statement from my mother's longtime attorney regarding the circumstances of the will amendment and the decedent's evident capacity. She located my mother's physician, who confirmed that while my mother had been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, her documented assessments in the months surrounding the will signing showed stable and sufficient executive function. Mild cognitive impairment, Dora reminded me, is not incapacity. It is a data point, one that the other side had been framing carelessly, with confidence that no one on my side of the table would push back. She also pulled my employment history from public record, not to announce it ahead of time, just to have it available. The night before the mediation, I drove to my mother's house one final time. I didn't go in. I sat in the car along the curb and looked at the porch light she had kept on a timer for as long as I could remember. I thought about the 9 entries, about the last one, about the fact that my mother, a woman who had never once made a decision she wasn't certain of, had spent the last year of her life making sure someone would understand exactly what she intended. She had known something might happen. She had prepared for it in the only way she knew how, quietly, precisely, with documentation. In the mediation room the next morning, I stayed still while my sister spoke. I stayed still while Cliff Hennessy outlined their position. I let them build the structure to its full height. Then Kathleen Vane set down her pen. She looked at Cliff Hennessy with the particular expression of someone who has read the background materials more carefully than the other side anticipated. "Counselor," she said, "before we continue with your client's characterization of her brother's conduct, have you reviewed his professional background in full?" Hennessy blinked. "He's retired, state government, some kind of social services." Kathleen Vane's expression didn't change. "Some kind," she repeated. I watched Hennessy recalibrate in real time. He glanced at my sister. My sister looked at the table. Dora rose without urgency. She placed one hand on the surface and addressed the room in the tone of someone who has nothing to prove. "My client," she said, "spent 31 years as a senior investigator with Indiana's Adult Services Financial Crimes Division. His work focused specifically on identifying and building prosecution cases for elder financial exploitation, the exact category of misconduct the filing before this body attempts to attribute to him. He has provided expert testimony in 38 proceedings. Several precedents in Indiana elder financial abuse case law were established partly through his investigative work." She paused. "The petition claims that my client used his position as a frequent caregiver to manipulate a vulnerable adult for financial gain. What we intend to demonstrate is that my client's presence in his mother's life was documented, consistent, and welcomed, and that his mother, who was neither incapacitated nor isolated, took deliberate steps over 14 months to make her intentions unmistakably clear." She placed the recorder on the table, not dramatically. She simply set it there, beginning with her own voice. What followed was not a confrontation. It was a series of facts arriving in order. Kathleen Vane listened to 3 complete recordings, including the final one. She did not take notes during the audio. She took notes afterwards steadily for several minutes. The statement from my mother's attorney was read into the record. It confirmed that my mother had contacted the office independently to initiate the will amendment, had arrived alone for the appointment, and had demonstrated clear understanding of the changes she was requesting and their legal implications. The physician's statement was presented. It confirmed capacity at the time of signing. My 31 years of employment, unit designation, and case specialization were entered without editorial comment. Cliff Hennessy objected 3 times. Kathleen Vane overruled him twice and sustained once, on a procedural point that changed nothing material to the outcome. My sister sat very still through most of it. Near the end, she said something low to Hennessy. He shook his head slightly. When everything had been presented, Kathleen Vane folded her hands. She looked at me directly. "I'd like to ask you one question." "Of course," I said. "Did you know the contents of the amended will before your sister filed this proceeding?" "I knew my mother had updated her will," I said. "She mentioned it. I didn't know the specific contents until after she passed. You didn't ask? No. She told me she had taken care of it. That was enough. Kathleen Vane was quiet for a moment. And the voice recordings, when did you find them? 3 days after I received the contested filing, I said. She nodded slowly. Then she turned back to the table. I'm denying the petition, she said. The amended will stand as executed. She paused. The characterizations made in the filing regarding undue influence are not supported by the documentation presented today. They appear, in fact, to be contradicted by it. I'll include that observation in the written ruling. She looked at Cliff Hennessy. Counselor, I'd encourage a thorough review of any further filings in this matter. Outside, Dora and I walked to the elevator without rushing. The building's hallway was quiet. A printer running somewhere down the corridor. The faint smell of old carpet. That's the first part, Dora said. I know, I said. The estate still goes through probate. It takes the time it takes. I'm familiar with how it takes time, I said. She looked at me sideways, and something that might have been a smile crossed her face. I imagine you are. My daughter called that evening. Her voice was different from the week before, quieter in a way that wasn't distance but something more like attention. Dora sent me the audio files, she said. I listened to all 9 of them. I waited. Grandma sounds exactly like herself, she said, right up to the end, completely exactly herself. She was, I said. A long pause. I should have asked you more questions before I said what I said. I'm sorry, Dad. You were handed information by someone you trusted, I said. That's not the same as choosing wrong. I knew Grandma had her mind about her, she said quietly. I just didn't want there to be a fight, so I didn't say it. I know. She was quiet for a moment. Then, does it feel like people understand what she wanted, like it's actually clear now? I thought about the 9 recordings, about the final entry, about my mother's voice saying I'm not worried about him. She made sure of it, I said. She left exactly what needed to be found. My daughter made a sound that was either a short laugh or something close to crying. That is so completely her, she said. It is, I agreed. She flew out the following month with her husband and the grandchildren. We ate dinner at the kitchen table and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of this. Her youngest had learned to ride a bike. Her husband was up for a promotion. She was planning a road trip to the coast in the summer. Before they left, she hugged me in the doorway and held on a moment longer than usual. I'm going to call more, she said. Me too, I told her. That was enough. The probate process moved at the pace it always moves. The house was appraised. The accounts were reviewed. Everything my mother had carefully and legally arranged was honored exactly as she had arranged it. The amended will was admitted without further challenge. My sister's attorney submitted a brief that Dora answered in 12 pages. The matter was closed in ordinary time. My sister sent a message through her attorney 4 months after the mediation. It was not an apology. It was a restatement of her position, softened at the edges with a request that we find a way to move forward as a family. I read it twice and set it aside. Some communications answer themselves by what they omit. Hers omitted any acknowledgement of what had been demonstrated in that room. Without that, there was nothing to meet halfway. I didn't sell my mother's house right away. I gave myself time. I went back on Sundays the way I had when she was alive, sitting in her kitchen with a cup of coffee and letting the house be what it was. She used to sit at that same table to do her lesson planning. She had kept the habit long after she retired, always needing something to organize in front of her. On the last Sunday before I listed it, I walked through the rooms one final time. I stood in her bedroom where the lockbox had been. I stood in the kitchen. I stood in the hallway where the lavender smell was finally, slowly beginning to fade. I had the digital recorder in my coat pocket. I had carried it since the day I found it. I took it out and held it for a moment without pressing play. I didn't need to hear it again to remember it. I knew it the way I knew her handwriting. I had spent 31 years documenting what people did to elderly individuals who trusted them. I had built those cases carefully, without anger, without announcement, because I understood that the most important work is the work done so thoroughly that it doesn't require explanation afterward. My mother had understood that too. She had organized her life that way, lesson plans and birthday cards, 9 voice recordings placed inside a gray metal box, a combination given to the right person at the right time. She had trusted me to do what I had always done, pay attention, work quietly, and let the documentation speak when the moment came. I put the recorder back in my pocket and walked out of her house for the last time. The autumn air was cool and clear. A few leaves had come down overnight and lay across the porch steps. I stood there for a moment and let myself feel what I had been holding at a careful distance for the better part of a year. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but something simpler and steadier than either. The particular satisfaction of having honored someone's trust completely, of having done the work the way she knew I would. Without announcement, without needing anyone to recognize it. The way she raised me. The last document I received from the probate court was a single page, estate closed, all distributions finalized in accordance with the will as amended and admitted. I set it on the kitchen table beside a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold and looked at it for a while without picking it up. Outside, a car passed on the street. A neighbor's dog was making noise at something in the yard, ordinary sounds finding their way back in. My mother used to say that a careful life leaves a clear record. She said it the way she said everything that mattered to her, once, plainly, as though she expected you to understand it the first time, and didn't see the point in repeating herself. She was right. A careful life leaves a clear record, and paper doesn't rewrite itself to protect anyone. It just holds what happened and waits, and eventually the right person comes along who knows how to read it. I have spent a lifetime being that person. If you've been written off by someone who assumed your silence meant you weren't paying attention, I'd like to hear from you. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me what time it is wherever you are. These are the stories worth telling. I have more of them.